The winter winds swept hard across the exposed concrete at RAF Oakington on the night of early February 1942, carrying with them the muted tremors of distant anti-aircraft fire rumbling somewhere across occupied Europe. Inside the operations hut, the amber glow of blackout-shielded lamps traced sharp silhouettes across tables, piled with reconnaissance photographs, radar diagrams, mission logs, and casualty summaries. At one corner of the room, Joan Curran pressed her fingers against the edges of a thin, metal-backed paper strip 27 centimeters long, scarcely wider than 2 fingers, while listening to the rain pepper the roof in hesitant bursts. She had sat through countless briefings before, but tonight the room felt different, heavier, as if the very walls knew that something fundamental in the British war effort was nearing a breaking point. The loudspeaker crackled overhead as ground controllers tracked returning Wellington bombers, their voices strained, each coded report a small coin tossed into the growing ledger of losses. Curran closed her eyes for a moment, tightening her grip on the strip of foil, and wondered whether any of tonight's returning crews might owe their survival to the idea taking shape in her hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For months now, she had watched the numbers tilt toward catastrophe. Reports from Bomber Command described missions where nearly half the operational aircraft failed to return. Crews who survived spoke of searchlights locking onto them with unerring, almost mechanical precision beams that swung from horizon to horizon as if guided by invisible hands. German night fighter pilots described the RAF bombers as lanterns hanging in a dark barn, an image that haunted Curran far more than the official statistics ever could. She knew exactly why. German radar installations Freya for long-range detection and Würzburg for precision tracking had begun forming an interlocking net across the European coastline. These were not hypothetical threats. They were real, material, and devastating. German operators, seated behind their glowing cathode ray displays, could identify a British bomber formation at distances exceeding 60 miles, long before the crews even glimpsed the coast. The radar pulses travelled effortlessly through night and cloud, indifferent to evasive manoeuvres or darkness. Meanwhile, British bombers still relied predominantly on altitude, timing, and darkness to evade the Luftwaffe, a strategy that had worked when radar was primitive and fragmented, but now faltered under the weight of German technological superiority. Curran had traced the problem back to the fundamentals of electromagnetic physics, studying every hertz of German operating frequencies. Freya pulsed with a wavelength of approximately 2.4 meters. Würzburg, far more dangerous, operated with a wavelength just over half a meter. The shorter the wavelength, the sharper the radar's resolution. On Würzburg screens, a Lancaster bomber did not appear as a vague suggestion of metal. It appeared as a fierce, unmistakable echo, a spike of returning energy so strong that operators could map its bearing, velocity, and approximate altitude with alarming clarity. That precision, rather than the guns themselves, was what allowed German flak batteries to anticipate the approach paths of British crews almost down to the minute. Speed, armour, evasive zigzags, none of these mattered if the enemy already knew where a bomber was headed. Curran had watched men in confusion and fear attempt to find a technical flaw in Germany's radar architecture. Some wanted to bomb radar sites directly, others wanted complex airborne jammers that Britain could scarcely afford to design, let alone produce. But she had chosen a different path, one so small and unorthodox that even her colleagues seemed reluctant to believe in it. She had begun experimenting after a colleague mentioned that thin metal strips, cut to half the wavelength of the radar beam, sometimes caused problematic reflections in laboratory equipment. At first, the idea of using such strips as a weapon seemed childish, even disrespectful to the scale of the suffering unfolding every night over Europe. But electromagnetic theory did not care about pride. Half a wavelength meant resonance meant amplification, and amplification meant chaos. For Würzburg radar, the half wavelength was approximately 27 centimeters. If thousands of reflective strips of this exact length were released into open air, they would each behave like miniature radar reflectors, each giving off a distinct return signal, each indistinguishable from an aircraft on the operator's screen. The more she calculated, the more the mathematics insisted on a singular conclusion. A bomber crew could blind an entire German radar grid by releasing nothing more elaborate than a cluster of 27-centimeter metallic ribbons drifting gently through the night sky. Curran could imagine the effect on a Würzburg operator. Instead of a handful of bomber echoes creeping toward a target, the screen would erupt with hundreds of false targets, each appearing to move with unpredictable drift patterns as the wind carried the strips. Operators would not be able to distinguish real aircraft from falling chaff. Flak batteries would fire into empty sky. Night fighters would circle aimlessly, hunting phantoms. And for the first time since the air campaign had begun, bomber command crews might have a genuine chance of reaching their targets and returning home. The simplicity of the solution, however, was also its greatest political liability. Air Vice Marshal Robert Reynolds had once remarked that the British military establishment did not mind complex innovations, they distrusted simple ones. Simplicity, in their view, implied fragility. A plan built from kitchen foil seemed suspiciously like desperation, and desperation was not something senior officers wanted to entertain publicly. Yet the truth was far more severe than institutional pride. Britain's very survival depended on crippling German industrial capacity, and that required bombers reaching their targets. If German radar continued to dominate, the Allied strategic bombing campaign risked collapsing entirely. In the cramped laboratory of the telecommunications research establishment, the air often tasted of solder, damp paper, and the faint ozone scent produced by vacuum tubes warming under prolonged voltage. Curran worked through formulas on a blackboard worn down by months of chalk dust. She tested strip densities, fall rates, dispersion patterns, and spectral reflections. She used wind tunnel data to estimate how long each strip might remain airborne under typical mission conditions. She calculated the weight cost, roughly £50 of chaff per bomber, a negligible addition compared to the several £1,000s of ordnance most aircraft already carried. Whenever she paused, her eyes drifted to the casualty summaries clipped to the corner of her desk. Teenaged gunners, navigators barely out of flight school, veterans who had flown dozens of missions, all reduced to faint pencil notes documenting their loss. Every name was a reminder that time was running thin. But theory alone meant nothing in wartime. What Curran needed was evidence, real, unambiguous evidence that her idea could work outside a quiet laboratory. She arranged with her colleagues to conduct controlled airborne tests along the British coastline. Twin-engine Bristol Blenheims flew slow, predictable paths, while chaff was released at timed intervals. Ground-based radar operators, unaware of what modifications had been made to the aircraft, observed the test runs without being told the nature of the experiment. The results startled even the scientists. On their screens, the bomber echoes bloomed and multiplied unpredictably. In some cases, the real aircraft signals were entirely submerged beneath the false returns. Operators struggled to determine which targets were real, sometimes misidentifying drifting chaff clouds as fast-moving aircraft, and vice versa. The fog of radar war, the carefully engineered distortion of electromagnetic clarity, was not just theoretically possible. It was demonstrably effective. The implications were enormous. If a single aircraft could scatter a radar field into confusion, an entire bomber formation could do so with overwhelming effect. Yet the idea also carried immense risk. British intelligence feared that if the Germans ever captured a chaff bundle, they would reverse engineer the method and use it against Britain's own defences. Entire debates erupted in conferences between the Air Ministry, Bomber Command, and scientific consultants. But the numbers left little room for philosophical caution. Every week, more British bombers failed to return. Every week, German radar refined its deadly efficiency. Curran continued refining deployment instructions. The strips needed to be bundled tightly so they would release sequentially rather than in tangled clumps. Each bundle required a simple paper wrapper that crews could tear open with gloved hands. Release timing had to consider wind direction, ground speed, and the bomber's altitude too early, and the chaff would drift harmlessly away. Too late, and radar operators might already have locked onto the real aircraft. She drafted guidelines showing that optimal release occurred shortly after entering German radar range, allowing the false echoes to overwhelm early detection systems before the aircraft reached the concentrated radar nets deeper inland. In her rare, quiet moments, Curran considered the psychological dimension of her work. Bomber crews often felt powerless against radar-guided defenses. They could not see the beams tracking them. They could not hear them. The threat was invisible yet lethally accurate. If her chaff could give crews even a small sense of agency, a way to fight back against the unseen architecture guiding their destruction, then perhaps the morale of Bomber Command might recover alongside its operational effectiveness. She never framed her work as heroism. To her, it was simply the application of physics toward preserving lives. But to the young men who climbed into the belly of each Lancaster, her work might mean the difference between returning to base and vanishing into the night over Germany. On a cold March morning in 1942, she stood before a group of RAF scientists and officers assembled in a briefing room. The tables were littered with charts, radar photographs, and fragments of test chaff. The atmosphere was taut, the air a mixture of skepticism and weary hope. As she began to explain the electromagnetic principles governing radar reflectivity, she sensed the room dividing into silent factions. Those who believed the idea too unorthodox to take seriously, and those who recognized that Britain's situation had grown dire enough to demand unconventional thinking. Her chalk scratched steady arcs across the blackboard as she illustrated how half-wavelength resonance magnified radar reflections in predictable, testable ways. She emphasized that the chaff was not random debris, it was engineered interference, purposeful chaos, ordered disorder. By the time she finished, the room had grown quiet, not dismissive quiet. Officers exchanged glances that revealed the unspoken question weighing on everyone present. Could the war in the air truly be shifted by 27-centimeter strips of household foil? No engines, no explosives, no intricate circuitry, just physics applied with ruthless simplicity. And so, Britain stood at the threshold of a new kind of warfare, one in which the battlefield was not merely physical territory but the unseen electromagnetic space between transmitter and receiver. Curran had illuminated a gap in German technological supremacy, a weakness hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to question foundational assumptions. She knew the challenge ahead was not only scientific but institutional. A weapon that looked like trash would be difficult to sell to commanders who expected machines of metal and fire. Yet the war did not reward pride. It rewarded what worked. And on that night in early 1942, as returning bombers limped home through fog and rain, their engines coughing and their fuselages scarred by flak, Joan Curran held in her hands a solution so small, so deceptively humble, that it might just turn the tide. She kept walking, boots clicking sharply on the concrete corridor as she left the meeting room behind, though the tension from it still seemed to cling to her shoulders like an unwelcome coat. She replayed the senior officer's words in her mind, the quiet dismissal disguised as professional caution. Interference requires precision, not clever guesses. She hated that sentence, hated the implication that the only innovations allowed were those born from established protocols. But she had grown accustomed to this pattern. Old men, old habits, old fears. None of them understood the urgency. None of them understood what she had seen when she was dispatched to study radar logs in southern England. She knew what the Germans were learning. She knew how quickly they were improving their systems. And she knew more than anything that Britain and America were running out of time to stay invisible. Outside, the winter air knifed across the base, carrying the metallic scent of fuel and the hum of distant generators. If she closed her eyes, she could almost hear the Luftwaffe, those low, methodical engine drones she learned to recognize during her weeks in London while the city was hammered night after night. When she opened them, she saw nothing but rows of Quonset huts and the slow glide of a maintenance vehicle across the runway. A bomber took off in the distance, engines lifting it like a giant steel heartbeat into a grey-blue sky streaked with contrails. She tightened her scarf, turned toward her small temporary lab building and tried to steady her thoughts. Anger helped nothing. Frustration helped nothing. She knew, better than most, that wartime innovation followed a strange logic: 1 part brilliance, 1 part brutality, 1 part bureaucracy. The work only mattered if you pushed through all 3. Inside, the lab was warm, cluttered, and humming with low machinery. Paper diagrams blanketed the desks. A surplus bomber radio set sat open like a dissected animal. A long bench held coils of wire, vacuum, tubes, copper sheets, and most out of place 2 rolls of common household aluminum foil. She gently closed the door behind her and let out the breath she had been holding since the meeting. She pulled up a chair, set her notebook on the bench, and began reviewing her calculations again. The German Würzburg radar operated at a wavelength she had grown painfully familiar with. She knew how it swept the skies, how it searched for the heavy metal bodies of bombers pushing through night. She knew how small distortions in its return signal caused operators to misjudge altitude or distance. And she knew that small distortions were exactly where her idea lived, if only someone with the authority to greenlight field tests would dare to believe her. She unrolled a sheet of foil, smoothing it flat across the bench surface. It glimmered softly under the lab lights. Such a flimsy thing, so delicate it tore under the weight of a misplaced finger. Yet the mathematics of war often favoured the absurd. Sometimes the most powerful weapons were not heavy fortresses or steel giants, but small, ridiculous ideas that slipped through the cracks of conventional thinking. She cut the foil into long strips, her hands steady despite her exhaustion. She held one of the strips up to the light, turning it slowly between her fingers. The strip bent and shimmered, fragile and harmless, but she imagined hundreds of them, thousands drifting behind a bomber formation, each one a tiny mirror, each one capable of catching, scattering, and confusing the radar's pulse. She set the strip down and closed her eyes. She imagined a German radar operator staring at his screen as bright blips bloomed across the display in wild, impossible numbers. She imagined the frantic calls, the scrambling of night fighters summoned to chase ghosts. She imagined bombers gliding untouched through a bewildered sky. She opened her eyes again and whispered, almost irritated at how hopeful she sounded, "This will work." She leaned forward over the table, recalculating angles, lengths, dispersion patterns. She knew she needed backing. She knew she needed someone high enough to override the skeptics, and she knew deeply that the war was changing faster than the higher-ups realized. German scientists were not asleep. German engineers were not clumsy or careless. They were brilliant, ruthless, and tireless. Every week they adjusted their antennas, refined their filters, and sharpened their detection software. Every week their searchlights found Allied bombers a little faster. Every week their flak became a little more precise. She rubbed her eyes and kept working. Hours passed like minutes. Machinery hummed. A distant siren wailed somewhere on the base, then stopped. She barely noticed. She was caught in the manic focus that came only when inspiration met necessity, when something needed to exist, and she happened to be the one available to drag it into reality. Footsteps sounded outside the lab door. Heavy boots, familiar cadence. She looked up just as the door pushed open, and a cold breeze swept inside. A tall man stepped in, removing his cap with a quiet nod. Colonel Harrington. Polished, stern, the sort of man who carried authority like a second spine. She straightened instinctively, though he did not command her directly. He glanced around the room at the machinery, at the diagrams, at the strips of foil spread like silver petals across the bench. He raised a brow. "So, it's true," he said. "You're still chasing this idea." She hesitated, unsure whether to defend or explain. "I'm refining it," she replied. "I'm not chasing anything." He walked closer, hands behind his back, eyes evaluating every scrap on her table with the silent calculation of someone who had judged countless inventions, schemes, and desperate wartime gambles. "Are you aware," he said slowly, "that the committee believes your idea to be, how did they phrase it, operationally fanciful?" She flushed, but forced her voice to stay even. "They're wrong." "Perhaps," he said, though without conviction. "But wrong ideas have cost many lives." She stepped forward, the accumulated urgency of the past weeks rising in her chest. "Colonel, radar isn't magic. It's just electromagnetic reflection. These strips don't need to be strong. They don't need to be durable. They don't even need to be symmetrical. They just need to interfere with the radar's pulses long enough to distort the picture. The Germans will see hundreds of false returns. They'll misjudge altitude. They'll send fighters chasing phantoms. Household foil will do this," he asked, staring at the strips with a skepticism that bordered on incredulity. "No," she said firmly, "but properly cut and properly dispersed foil will." He studied her for a long moment. She could feel the weight of the decision forming behind his eyes. There were men like him who safeguarded the boundaries of military logic, ensuring foolish risks didn't slip through the cracks. But sometimes those same men, pushed far enough by desperation or inspired by courage not entirely their own, allowed miracles to occur. At last he sighed. "You're asking for flight tests?" "Yes," she said. "Just one." He nodded slightly, and she felt a faint spark of hope. "And," he added, "you're asking for them soon." "Every night we wait," she said. "More bomber crews don't come home." His jaw tightened. He was a stern man, but not a cruel one. He had read the reports. He had seen the numbers, the roaring engines that took off full of young men and returned with empty seats, empty bunks, empty futures. He turned away, walked slowly across the lab, then stopped near the radio equipment. "Do you really believe," he said quietly, "that this could shift the balance? Not just theoretically, but in real time, in the skies those boys fly. Through?" She swallowed and answered without hesitation. "I know it will." The room fell silent. Machines hummed. A single strip of foil drifted off the edge of the table and wafted to the floor like a feather. The colonel exhaled, turned back to her, and said in a tone that was both resigned and strangely hopeful, "Very well. You'll have your test." She blinked, hardly believing it. "I, Colonel, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "If this fails, the committee will bury it, and you with it. If it succeeds, well, then we may just turn the night sky into something far more manageable." He gave her a final nod, placed his cap back on, and stepped out of the room. The moment the door closed, she let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half disbelief. She sank into her chair, her body shaking with adrenaline. She had fought so long just to be heard. Now she had a chance to prove everything. A single chance. She picked up the fallen strip of foil, held it in her fingers, and whispered, "Please work." The next 48 hours blurred into a frenzy of preparation. She cut hundreds of strips, adjusting lengths experimentally, calculating dispersion patterns over and over, sketching release mechanisms for the bomber crews. Sleep became optional. Coffee and determination replaced it. She tested the reflective properties of every strip under controlled conditions, adjusting the alignment of each batch to match the precise wavelength used by German ground radar. When the day of the test arrived, the air across the base felt electrified, crisp, buzzing, expectant. A.B. 24 bomber had been prepared for the mission, its crew briefed on the unusual payload. The men were curious, some amused, some openly doubtful. But in war, soldiers flew with stranger cargoes so long as their orders were clear. She stood on the cold tarmac, bundled in her coat, watching the bomber's engines ignite one by one. Each roar vibrated in her chest. She clutched her clipboard, knuckles white, as the plane began its slow roll toward the runway. Colonel Harrington stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes forward. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The bomber gathered speed, wheels screaming against the ground, then lifted heavy, majestic, climbing into the broad morning sky. She followed it with her eyes until it disappeared into a bank of clouds. Now all they could do was wait. Inside the radar tracking room, technicians leaned over their consoles, adjusting dials and calibrating screens. She and the colonel stood behind them, watching the sweeping radar arm circle rhythmically around its oscilloscope face. The test would be simple. The bomber would fly a predetermined path. Midway, the crew would release the foil bundles. And then, if her calculations held, the radar would display something never before seen in Allied or Axis operations. The green line swept the screen in steady arcs. A small blip appeared. The bomber. It moved along its expected path. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The technician monitoring the console frowned slightly and muttered, "Signal clean. Stable." Then, 2 minutes later, he leaned closer, adjusting the gain. "Sir?" he murmured. There's something odd happening." Her breath caught. The blip, once a single, strong point, began to expand, then distort, then multiply. The technician blinked, baffled. That shouldn't be possible. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Another operator stepped closer. His eyes widened. "There are a dozen returns now. No more. They're flickering. Shifting position. This can't be right." She felt her knees weaken. The screen filled with scattered, chaotic points of light, hundreds of false echoes blooming like a constellation in motion. Some moved smoothly, others jerked erratically. The real bomber was lost among them like a single drop in a storm. It was working. It was working exactly as she had predicted. One technician exclaimed, "It's a whole formation." Another countered, "No, look, some of the blips are vanishing, reappearing. This is—" "Sir, we're blind." Colonel Harrington stared at the screen, expression unreadable. Slowly, he exhaled and turned to her. "My God," he whispered, "you did it." Her throat tightened. The tension of countless sleepless nights washed away like water down a drain. She felt tears threatening her eyes, but she held them back, jaw trembling with a mixture of relief, triumph, and overwhelming exhaustion. The chaos on the radar screen did not subside. German systems would respond differently, she knew, but the fundamental physics would remain. The confusion would remain. The clutter, the fear, the blindness. When the bomber returned safely to the base, the pilots were wide-eyed with disbelief. They reported that the foil spread beautifully, drifting behind them like shimmering confetti. From the cockpit, it had looked almost festive, like pieces of a celebration being cast across the sky. In a way, it was. An hour later, she sat in a small debriefing room, sipping lukewarm tea with trembling hands, while officers murmured excitedly in the hallways. The committee that had once dismissed her idea was now assembling again, this time in a state of near-frantic eagerness. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the cup steady her nerves. She had done it, but she also knew the war would not pause for her victory. The real test, the only test that mattered, lay ahead. Night missions, real combat, real radar, real death waiting in the dark, and she knew that once the Germans realized what was happening, they would scramble desperately to counter it. Innovation never stopped, not on either side, but she had bought the Allies. Something precious time for bombers to slip through the night unseen, time for missions to succeed, time for crews to come home. She stood when the colonel entered the room again. His expression was lighter, now still stern, but touched with something like pride. "The committee wants a full briefing," he said. "You'll present everything." She nodded, adjusting her uniform. "I'm ready." He opened the door, but before she stepped through, he rested a hand briefly on her shoulder. "You may have just changed the air war," he said quietly. "Don't ever let anyone convince you small ideas don't matter." She walked into the corridor with him, the noise of urgent voices rising all around as officers hurried toward the meeting room. She felt no fear this time, no doubt, no hesitation. She had come here to fight with equations instead of rifles, with foil instead of firepower, with intellect instead of artillery. And now, finally, someone was willing to listen. As she crossed the threshold into the briefing room, she carried with her not just the weight of what she had accomplished, but the knowledge that the skies over Europe would never be the same. Because somewhere inside the vast machinery of war, a simple idea, a fragile strip of foil, had become a weapon powerful enough to rewrite the night. The room felt almost too bright when she stepped inside, as if the overhead lights had been turned up in anticipation of some breakthrough none of them had expected. Officers filled the long table, their uniforms crisp, their expressions alert in a way she had not seen before. Charts were already laid out. A blackboard waited near the far wall, chalk resting neatly at its base. The hum of low conversation died the moment she entered. Colonel Harrington cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, this is the engineer behind the interference concept we tested this morning." His voice carried a tone unmistakably different from before: respect, acknowledgement, and something like restrained admiration. "She will brief us on the results." Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Men who had dismissed her, ignored her, or simply never bothered to consider the ideas of someone outside the traditional hierarchy, now watched her with an intensity usually reserved for frontline reports. She felt the weight of their attention settle across her shoulders, but instead of shrinking beneath it, she inhaled deeply and let the breath steady her. She walked to the front of the room and placed several foil strips on the table. The men eyed them skeptically, as if unable to reconcile their simplicity with the magnitude of the test results being whispered among them. She spoke clearly. "Radar functions by detecting reflected electromagnetic energy. These strips, cut to precise lengths proportional to the radar's wavelength, scatter that energy unpredictably. When dispersed in sufficient quantities, they create a cloud of false echoes that overwhelms the detection system." She gestured toward the blackboard. The test flight released 2 bundles over a predetermined grid. The resulting radar distortion was significant enough to obscure the aircraft entirely. Operators reported up to 200 false returns. Several officers exchanged looks, eyebrows raised, pens clicking against notebooks. General Alden, a tall man with a stern jawline and a reputation for demanding both perfection and proof, leaned forward. "The German systems use slightly different wavelengths. Will your strips interfere with those as effectively?" "Yes," she answered. "We confirmed their frequency parameters weeks ago. Adjustments can be made to maximize disruption, but even unoptimized strips would still create chaos." A murmur rippled around the table. Another officer spoke up. "How easily can this be produced?" "Very easily," she replied. "Any manufacturing facility handling radio components or conductive material can do it." In fact, she held up a strip. Even standard foil works with minor adjustments. The room went quiet. The officers stared not at her now, but at the strip itself, as though oracles of war might be found hidden in its shimmering surface. General Alden leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping the table. "If deployed during a raid," he said slowly, testing each word, "this could render our aircraft invisible to enemy night fighters." "Invisible," she repeated softly. "Or worse. The Germans won't just lose track. They'll think they're tracking an entire fleet, or no fleet, or a scattered mess of contradictory data." The general looked almost startled. "They won't know which blips are real. They'll be blind," she said, "and blindness, in war, is as decisive as firepower." Silence settled heavily. It was the kind of silence that indicated minds racing far faster than conversation could keep up. At last, Alden stood. "This is no longer an experiment. This is a priority. Effective immediately, mass production will begin." He turned toward her, and his expression softened. "Your work will be implemented across Bomber Command." Her heartbeat fluttered. Weeks of frustration, months of doubt, and now this acceptance, validation, and more importantly, action. The meeting dissolved into fast-moving conversation. Officers scribbled directives. Messengers hurried out the door. A few approached her to ask for precise measurements or technical specifics they had previously ignored entirely. Some shook her hand. Some simply nodded, as though acknowledging her in a new way, seeing her for what she truly was. Not an auxiliary, not a theorist tucked into a lab, but someone whose ideas might save lives. She answered questions for nearly an hour before the room finally emptied, leaving her alone in the sudden quiet. She stood still, letting the noise in her own mind settle. The strips of foil lay on the table, innocuous and gleaming. War was strange. The things that shifted its tides were rarely what anyone expected. She left the building and walked out into the cold afternoon air. Snow had begun to fall, thin flakes drifting lazily downward, landing silently on her coat. She inhaled deeply, the cold biting at her lungs. She felt light, buoyant, overwhelmed by what had just unfolded. But she also felt something else. A pressure, a responsibility. She knew the Germans would respond. They were brilliant adversaries. Their scientists worked under conditions of brutal pressure but immense resources. They would not remain blind for long. They would adjust filters, recalibrate frequencies, redesign their detection algorithms. The success of her foil strips would force their hand. War was a dialogue of minds, each answering the other in the language of adaptation. She walked back to her lab, snow melting in her hair. When she opened the door and stepped inside, the warmth washed over her. Her equipment lay just as she had left it. Her notebooks waited on the bench. And for a long moment, she simply stood there, soaking in the familiar hum of machines. Then she sat down, pulled her notebook close, and began planning the next steps. She did not leave the lab until dinner time, when her stomach finally reminded her she hadn't eaten since dawn. She walked to the mess hall with her coat wrapped tight and her mind full of radar frequencies, dispersion patterns, and ways to streamline production. But the moment she stepped inside the hall, she was caught off guard. Half a dozen bomber crewmen were gathered near the serving line. When they saw her, they straightened. One of them, an older pilot with a streak of silver in his hair, stepped forward, offering a small, respectful nod. "You're the one who made that blizzard thing?" he asked. She blinked. "The interference strips?" "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, we heard about the test. If this thing keeps the German fighters off our backs—" He paused, voice tightening. "It means a hell of a lot." Another crewman chimed in. "We lost 5 planes last week. Good men. If your idea works out there, not just in tests." "Thank you." She felt heat rise behind her eyes but managed a steady reply. "That's exactly why I did it." The men nodded, their expressions warm, grateful, tired in a way only those who confronted death nightly could understand. They moved on, but the moment stayed with her long after she'd collected her food and found a quiet corner to sit. After eating, she returned to her quarters, exhaustion settling over her. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, boots still on, coat still buttoned. The barracks lights flickered softly. The building creaked as the wind pressed against its walls. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to lie back and close her eyes. She didn't sleep. Instead, memories rose, unbidden memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. The first time she had seen a bomber shot down, the streak of fire across the sky, the way the wreckage had spiraled downward in brutal, slow motion, the distant explosion that followed, the awful quiet afterward. She had been stationed in England then, working late in a radar room, listening to frantic reports over the radio. She'd listened helplessly as a crew screamed that they were hit, that they were going down, that they couldn't hold altitude. She'd never forgotten the sound. It echoed now in her mind, reminding her exactly what was at stake. She sat up again, rubbing her face. She could rest later. When the war was over, for now, she needed to keep working. She returned to the lab. It was empty at this hour, dimly lit, silent except for the soft ticking of a clock. She switched on the desk lamp. The warm glow illuminated her calculations, her sketches, her strips of foil. She pulled her chair close and began revising the design again, thickness, conductivity, the exact length to wavelength ratio. Perhaps production could be streamlined further. Perhaps deployment could be automated. The bomber crews had enough to worry about without managing a release mechanism by hand. She became lost in her work again, the world narrowing into equations and possibilities. Hours drifted by unnoticed. Snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the military base in white. Around midnight, a knock sounded at the door. She startled, blinking the fatigue from her eyes. "Come in." The door opened, and Colonel Harrington stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He looked as exhausted as she felt. "You're still working?" he asked. She managed a tired smile. "Always." He nodded approvingly. "Word has already spread. The General Staff is drafting orders for full-scale deployment. Production begins at sunrise." "That's good," she said quietly. He studied her for a long moment. "You did something remarkable today. You should be proud." She glanced at the foil strips, then back at him. "It's just physics." He gave a soft huff of laughter. "No. It's courage. And stubbornness. And vision." He paused, expression sobering. "Not many people have all three." She looked down, suddenly unsure how to respond. The colonel stepped closer. "There's something else. Our intelligence reports indicate the Germans have upgraded their Freya systems along the coast. Their detection range is increasing. If they perfect their tracking, our bombers will face losses we can't sustain." He crossed his arms. "Your work may be the only thing standing between us and disaster." She straightened, the weight of his words grounding her. "Then, we need to move faster." He nodded. "We will." The colonel left a moment later, leaving her once again in the quiet of her lab. But this time she felt something different, not fear, not pressure, but an expanding sense of purpose. Her work mattered. Her mind, her persistence, her refusal to accept dismissal, it all mattered. The next morning, the base surged with activity. Machines roared to life. Trucks rolled across the tarmac, carrying crates of aluminum strips. Officers hurried between buildings, issuing new directives. Pilots gathered in briefing rooms to learn how to deploy the interference method during missions. She stood among them in one room, presenting the new release mechanism to a group of bomber crews. The men listened intently, some leaning forward, others taking notes. One young navigator, barely 20, raised his hand. "What if the enemy figures it out?" he asked. She met his gaze evenly. "Then we adapt faster than they do." He nodded, and she sensed that her confidence steadied them, gave them something solid to hold on to in the swirling uncertainty of the air war. News spread across the base quickly. Some called the strips window, others called it silver rain. The British crews had their own slang for it, but no matter the name, everyone knew what it represented, a fighting chance. By evening, she stood again on the airfield as a formation of bombers prepared for a night raid. Their engines warmed, rumbling like thunder held on a leash. The crews climbed aboard, lights flickered. The scent of oil and cold metal hung in the air. She walked alongside Colonel Harrington to the edge of the runway. The sky glowed faintly with the last traces of twilight. "You've given them hope," the colonel said. She shook her head. "I've given them a tool. Hope is what they carry themselves." The first bomber began to roll down the runway, engines roaring. She watched, heart pounding, as it lifted into the air. Another followed, then another. Each climbed with deliberate grace, disappearing into the gathering darkness. As the last bomber lifted off, she felt the cold wind whip across her face. She pulled her coat tight and stared into the night where the aircraft had vanished. Somewhere in that dark, the German radar operators would soon encounter something beyond their understanding. Blizzards of false signals, clouds of shifting echoes, a sky alive with ghosts. And somewhere in that dark, those men in the bombers, young, weary, brave, would have a chance to make it home. She whispered into the wind, barely audible even to herself. "Come back safe." Colonel Harrington placed a gloved hand on her shoulder. "Let's get inside. We'll monitor the radar." She nodded, and together they walked toward the operations building. The night was just beginning. The war was far from over. But the balance in the sky had shifted because of her, because of an idea fragile enough to tear between her fingers, yet powerful enough to blind an empire. And now, for the first time in a very long while, she allowed herself to believe something she had almost forgotten. They might just win. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.